Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're excited to bring some of our panelists back for a continuation of the discussion yesterday afternoon on the July 28th webinar. We didn't have quite enough time to answer all your questions, so we wanted to do that today. So again, I just want to reintroduce Bill Nesper, League of American Bicyclists, Darren Buck with the Federal Highway Administration, Chris Bruntlett with the Dutch Cycling Embassy, Will Hansfield with the Washington, D.C. Department of Transportation, and Nathan Wilkes with the City of Austin. So we're thrilled to have you all back. And I actually wanted to start by revisiting a question where we left the discussion yesterday afternoon. We were touching on some really important equity issues and how we can go about really enhancing comfort and especially focusing and elevating the needs of communities of color, low-income communities. And I just wanted to revisit that topic and allow you all to maybe share any other thoughts you had on that. I mean, we're really facing a lot of challenges in this area, or a lot of we're being put on the spot in a lot of ways, I think, as a field to really make sure that we're providing safe, comfortable networks for everybody. So Nathan, Darren, I know you had some comments to share. I'll let you all take it from here.
Yeah, well, I guess just adding on, this is Nathan, adding on to what I said yesterday, which was largely that, just kind of waking up and trying to grapple with, the real kind of institutional racism in all of our systems. There are very large things at play, and I mentioned like even the state of Texas taxing structure, which is displacing, so there is like a more kind of micro element that I did want to kind of really kind of come back to, which is, and you see this in what New York did, but there's a lot, and Austin has a long tradition of how we go about developing our projects and having a conversation with the community about them. And I think this is a critical kind of trust building and kind of listening exercise. So we, and this is largely to the credit of our bicycle program manager from, over 10 years ago, Anik Boudet, who's a planner by trade, and really realized with a meltdown that came in the early 2000s that we needed a robust public process to deliver these projects. And so we thoroughly kind of present kind of what the opportunities are, what could be gained, and we have we listen a lot, and we kind of respond, and we hear all sorts of stuff in the process of that conversation and the listening. And the way we always talk about it in the public is that, through this process, our projects get stronger. We are also very open that they may not move forward, that the no build is an option. And I think it's really important to lay that intention out there. And, what we are looking in presenting the ideas of how our cities and how our streets can change is, are there concerns? What are the concerns? Are the concerns kind of real and valid? And for anything, even if just one person says it, are these, working to find kind of solutions, or at least understanding the concern. So a concern as deep as, do I feel safe? Does a non-white person feel safe on a street? Whether or not there's, safety improvements from a modal perspective, like, is a very kind of deep and very kind of worthwhile question that needs a lot of kind of thinking and resource. And like I said, making sure that we bring light to that and talk about it and bring resource to what is almost certainly going to be a multifaceted approach. The more different kind of dimensions we bring at those problems, the more likely we are to move them forward.
Thanks for that, Nathan. Yeah,
I'll
go ahead.
build off of something that Nathan said, and that's about the no build alternative always being an option. It's very hard, I think, for those of us who have entered transportation planning, especially in a bicycle and pedestrian realm, to really embrace that mentality that the no build is always an option, because we really do wear the love of our projects on our sleeves. And with most of the conversations with a community that is low income or is predominantly a community of color, you really need to sort of center the needs of that community in your planning effort. And that is terribly difficult to do, one, when you really are coming with a project that you truly feel is going to enhance quality of life, but the community itself probably has different ideas, and centering the community is often very difficult, and accepting that mindset that no build really is an option is kind of, I think, a core entry point. Centering the needs of a community is extra hard now in these times where we can't even do our traditional outreach processes that themselves often excluded communities of color and low-income communities. It's engagement itself is highly disrupted right now, and I don't know what the answer is. And maybe in the same way that there's, you know, sort of an inflection point on how streets operate, perhaps there's an inflection point in how we conduct engagement, and perhaps online virtual public involvement is maybe there is an opportunity to build an engagement model that reaches more of the community, that centers low income and communities of color in outreach. But I think we have to sort of work consciously towards that. I'll throw in a commercial announcement for we have an initiative within Federal Highway called Virtual Public Involvement that's run through our Office of Planning. It certainly predates our current situation, but it's really just about best practices and case studies in using virtual public involvement to do outreach, and that suite of tools and case studies may be relevant to communities out there as they struggle with basically remaking their whole process on the fly.
The other really quick thing is that these are, I keep coming back to this word, and it's a really tricky and kind of amorphic realm, or it's hard to give the kind of time and energy to get out of your discipline, whatever your discipline is or your focus. But intersectional areas are like where the work really is, what I've kind of come to understand. And you know, I just saw Portland has I think it's a proposed funding package, lots of multimodal funding, and they built into it anti-displacement kind of funding and resource, which gets to, like, you know, if you have displacement concerns, and almost I think even in the Netherlands they have displacement concerns, if you have those problems, you need to bring tools relevant to them, and you can't just kind of push them aside and say, well, that's out of our realm, we can't do anything about it. So I think we need to get smarter about working in a much more broad and holistic way. Yeah.
So this is Chris. I just had one other kind of perspective to add, which I think is relevant to the conversation happening right now in a lot of U.S. cities, and that's around the role of the police in these communities. I think there's a lot of talk about all these things that police are now expected to do in current days, from social work to mental health work, and traffic enforcement is something that we also assume they should be responsible for, and I would certainly challenge that as a necessity, coming from the Netherlands, which is a country where the police actually do very little traffic enforcement. They instead focus on the engineering rather than the enforcement portion of it. So there's this approach that focuses on the streets, the design of the streets, to ensure that the users are behaving accordingly, rather than trying to police them into behaving accordingly. So if they're driving faster than they should be, it's seen as an engineering issue rather than a speed blitz issue, for them to go out and conduct random stops to people that are breaking the law. So the police here in the Netherlands actually do very little in terms of traffic enforcement. It's always seen as a design issue, and I think this idea of self-enforcing streets could go a long way to saving money and saving conflict in cities if we allow the engineers themselves to dictate the behavior that they want to see on the streets, rather than expect the police to do it for them.
Great points all around. Thanks. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say on that topic, it's really something we're trying to explore more in the district. We have a pilot going right now to do slow streets where the speed limit is 15 miles per hour, which for us is a very different approach, with movable barriers at every end of a block face and local traffic only. So the idea being that we are trying to explore those streets that are designed to be a slower speed overall. But it's just getting started. I mean, I think there's another part that we have an advantage where our citywide speed limit's 25, which is lower than most places, and we're just lowering the local streets to 20 miles per hour. So I think on a lot of different fronts, we're trying new things. But yes, I completely agree that the more we can design streets that feel comfortable going slower, the better off we'll all be. The other tactic we use is the automated traffic enforcement, which is, in a way, it's a blind way of doing enforcement, so that, you know, the easiest way to not get a ticket, you just don't drive over the speed limit, you won't get one, but it's enforced pretty broadly. Some of the unique issues we face is our neighboring jurisdictions of Maryland and Virginia, we don't have reciprocity, so you get 1,000 tickets if you live in one of those areas, and so long as you don't ever get pulled over in the district, you'll never face any sort of accountability for it. So, and that in fact happens. We have some good documentation on a few individuals that have hundreds, if not thousands, of tickets. So we're working on a couple different things, but it's very clear that the engineering is what affects that change, and no amount of enforcement is sustainable.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for all those comments. I think it's a really comprehensive approach to a very complicated problem that we're seeing. So let me get into a question here that came up quite a few times yesterday, and could be handled in a lot of different ways. But I wanted to get your thoughts on the question of bike helmets. So when Chris, you were sharing your slides and all those images, great images of the Dutch, people started writing in, wow, I don't see anybody wearing helmets in these pictures, and that's a very different sort of approach from here in the U.S., where we tend to push the bicycle helmet quite a bit, and that has its proponents and its detractors. And I wanted to ask you all to weigh in. Maybe Chris, I'll start with you, kind of representing the Dutch experience on bike helmets and their role in really getting people out on bikes and making people safe.
Yeah, I think this is a question we get all the time, and the first thing I always say is that those photos are not, misrepresenting the situation on the street here in the Netherlands. I mean, virtually nobody wears the helmet here. It's the latest statistics were about 0.5% of all cyclists don a helmet, so that's 1 in every 200 people on a bike are wearing helmets, and that's mostly just the sports cyclists that are out riding for sport and recreation. The general approach is that cycling is healthy, cycling is safe, cycling is something that's done by everybody, and the street should be designed as such to keep and maintain that safety and that comfort level, rather than requiring people to wear personal protective equipment, much as we do in the workplace. The focus on removing the risk, rather than armoring ourselves against the risk, is always the first step. And in general, there's just this acceptance that cycling is healthy, and everybody should be doing it, and the less restrictions and things we put in place to scare people off of it, the better. So as a result, helmet use has not really become normalized here. But you may be surprised to learn that this is a bit of a kind of counterintuitive situation, but it's also one of the safest places in the world to ride a bike. So I think more than anything, it shows that perhaps we've overemphasized helmet use in our approaches to bicycle safety, and that we should be much more focused on the separation and the slowing from motor vehicles.
Chris is exactly right.
Yeah.
I was just going to say the safest bicycling cultures in the world all have helmet use rates approaching 0%, and it's almost an inverse correlation among at least the GCD that the less safe you are, the higher your helmet use will be. It's fascinating, but I would postulate that the closer we get to a much safer situation for cyclists, we will start seeing a much lower helmet rate.
I was just going to say that this is one of the huge values of having a place like the Netherlands to look at, because this is not a theoretic debate. Like, this is the case on the ground, and you can go see it, and you can understand why, and you can work towards that rather than hypothesize about something that really isn't a core solution to the problem. So yeah, great to have those examples, and then we miss decades of wrong turns and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, your colleagues at PBIC, they put together that head safety info briefing, and it referenced the NIOSH hierarchy of controls. Sorry to get a little wonky here, but Chris pretty much described it, where I think what we're talking about here is engineering a safety solution that helps sort of isolate the unsafe conditions. And that's very much a design question. And that works very independently from asking people to wear personal protective equipment in the form of a helmet. They're two independent solutions to a safety problem. And we're sort of, as a practitioner community, working on that engineering isolation from hazard part of the hierarchy. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the harm of a crash through a helmet is it's a good countermeasure. It's a counter head injuries, but on an engineering solution is not mutually exclusive. It's something that needs to be done as well.
I think a relatable way to understand this, I always talk about protected bike lanes in terms of sidewalks, and that people would not take like a stripe on a shoulder of a highway to be a safe place to walk. Just in the same way that we would never ask the question of why aren't there pictures of people walking in the Netherlands with helmets? So those two things go hand in hand. Like, bicycling should be as safe as walking, and therefore at that point, when you're traveling 12 miles an hour on a bike, without cars right next to you, you don't need a helmet.
Yeah, I think I should jump in, being that we as an organization at the league promote helmet use and have done. I think everything that has been said about leading with engineering and making a safe environment for people to ride where they wouldn't need this kind of protection, I think is definitely the goal, without a doubt. And we don't want to make it seem like bicycling is a very dangerous activity. But of course, a lot of streets aren't built to the standard in the United States. So we continue to propose the self protective equipment until we get to that point. So I'll just say that I think a lot of communities though are facing I don't know, in some ways anti-infrastructure or improvement efforts, and are often hearing leading instead with helmet use and these sorts of protective equipment over making safe networks. So I think we have that backwards, but we do continue to promote helmet use.
Great, thanks for those comments. I think it's a complicated topic that many people have opinions on, but I appreciate all your perspectives. I think the points are well taken. I wanted to jump to a question about somebody had asked a question: to what extent is micromobility, sort of e-scooters, other devices, impacting the Dutch approach to bicycle facility development? I think we've seen some examples of how U.S. cities are considering e-scooter users and others, in addition to bicyclists, as some of these they're users of the low-stress bike networks. And I'm wondering if that's it's happening in the Netherlands as well. Chris, I don't know if you could touch on that from your perspective.
And hopefully you talk about mopeds.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the approach to kick scooters up to this point has been to ban them outright nationally. So they are not allowed to even be sold in the Netherlands. You will see them on the streets from time to time, but they risk being stopped and fined by the police. But having said that, there's an entire mix of different vehicles that people are riding that you'll see. E-bikes, cargo bikes, yes, the gas-powered mopeds, and the like. And the general approach to that has been to let it mix on the cycle tracks, with the understanding that those cycle tracks are more often than not designed with enough width to allow for a slight mix of speeds, as long as they're under 30 kilometers an hour or about 20 miles per hour. So the comparison that's often made between the NACTO guidelines for the width of a cycle track and the CRO manual, and the CRO actually mandates an additional width of 50 centimeters per lane, with allowances to go even wider than that. And that allows for, small children to cycle next to people on e-bikes, people to ride side by side and comfortably pass each other, and even, people in manual wheelchairs and mobility devices, disabled people to use the cycling infrastructure as well. That's not to say it's perfect and it always works, but that has been the general approach up to now. And as those cycle tracks get more congested, the idea is that they're trying to push for 30-kilometer-hour speed limits on a lot of the urban streets, and then allow some of that traffic to start mixing with motor vehicles. The first being the gas-powered mopeds in certain municipalities, which are now being banned from the cycling infrastructure with a mandate to ride on the street with the cars as long as the cars are slowed to an appropriate speed. So it's a very Dutch problem to have, these congested cycleways, but one they continue to struggle with, and the idea is just, will mean that they have to continue creating space in the cities for these modes of travel as more and more devices come online, and the kick scooters are inevitably next once the national government decides what to do with them.
Just to jump in.
This is Darren. We're kicking off some work with the Volpe Center on e-bikes in general, and particularly focusing in on how e-bikes fit into public lands and trail systems, but doing an overall look at e-bikes and how they may change the dynamics on bicycle travel facilities. We also have a group at USDOT working across different modes, looking at micromobility impacts, and the design implications that Chris touched on are important. There are speed, there are just dynamic differences between how a traditional bicycle, how an e-bike, how a scooter operates. When DC had the 10-mile-per-hour limit, if you were in a protected bike lane behind a scooter, you were held up, but then that scooter may speed past if you went up a hill, because I am a slow bike rider. And so what we're increasingly seeing in design guidance at the state level, and what we've captured in our NHI bicycle facility design course, is starting to consider volumes and starting to consider these different types of vehicles in determining how wide your bicycle facility is, to allow for passing within, say, a protected bike lane where there is a constrained right of way. That's something that really American design guidance hasn't traditionally dealt with too much, but we're increasingly seeing, and I think we increasingly need to account for.
I think a super important thing to say here is that electric, I mean, I brought up the mopeds in the Netherlands because, 30 mile an hour, heavier, moped is heavier than a bicycle. Like that type of use is not compatible with like an 8 to 80 test. Like that is very intimidating if you're a parent biking with a child. Like, and from what I understand, that has deteriorated the quality of, the infrastructure is what it is, but the kind of perceived quality and the actual safety of it is decreased because that use vehicle class is there. And it's not the combustion engine, like an electric, battery powered thing that's just as heavy could go just as fast. So I think the important thing to be vigilant about and watch with all this micromobility stuff, which in Austin has been very positive, like scooters gave rise to this overnight, kind of doubled the amount of kind of small, whether pedal powered or electric vehicles on the streets, and people became kind of incensed with the idea that they were either blocking traffic lanes or they were on downtown sidewalks, which is the exact problem behind the lack of a bike network before scooters existed. So it's elevated the problem and gotten more traction behind. We need an all ages and abilities bike network, which is good. But we need to be really careful to not allow electric things to go, the European standard is electric bikes can't go over 15 miles an hour. In the US, it's 20. There's some loopholes that get them up to 20, 28. Like that is 28 is very fast, and we shouldn't allow those type of loopholes, but we just need to be really careful with what type of speed profile we allow non-human powered kind of transport to have in our protected bike lane and all ages abilities bike network infrastructure.
That's great. Thanks for that. I hope that folks will kind of look at some of the micromobility resources that are out there and the ones that are coming to kind of help them make decisions about the development of their facilities. I wanted to finish the discussion here with a really big issue, the role of funding. Obviously, these projects aren't getting on the ground without funding, and wanted to ask you all to weigh in on how you see the role of funding, whether local, state, or federal, in getting these projects done, and maybe what opportunities and challenges you anticipate in the future related to funding. I don't know who wants to take that one first.
I'll kick it off. This is Darren. I'm part of an NCHRP panel that's looking across the 52 state DOTs to sort of look at how they do project selection for ped and bike projects. I think that's going to give kind of a good insight as to, or at least a snapshot of where people are. And I think as more states begin to embrace more pedestrian and bicycle plans, policies, and general orientations, we're going to begin to see more consideration of that in the project selection process. AASHTO has been doing a lot of work. They are kicking off an effort to do a research roadmap into ped and bike that will hopefully help advance the state of the practice at the state level. And then in individual states, I'm not going to call out any, but you tend to see, you're seeing some very progressive design guidance. You're seeing some very progressive project selection and statewide planning happening in both ped and bike. So I'm kind of optimistic that states are increasingly going to be using the discretion that they have in using federal funding to sort of tackle some of the high capital ped and bike projects, some of the needs and linkages that can be made on the state system. But then as Nate and I were discussing sort of before the session, there's always a challenge in determining whether something is more easily done under federal or local, and generating local funding is always it's a challenge for every community.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump right in there with an antithesis, which a lot of the reason that I built the All Ages and Abilities Bike Network kind of network vision was not just like the Sevilla story of like build it fast and you will get kind of network response. It was also that I had enough experience like getting grant funds for a particular mile long street. It's incredibly like painful and constrained and overhead intensive process. The same thing with like local bond propositions. When you start naming streets like we're going to do this street, or this project, and this other project, unless they're really big critical projects that you want to like absolutely commit to your voting public that is going to happen. Like we've done this for just major barriers like that I think is appropriate. But if you're going to build a network, you need highly flexible I'm all about like programs where you're committed to the public to be kind of accountable and transparent, but flexible to respond to the situation. You might be piggybacking on another capital project or covering a funding shortfall or following street resurfacing where the slate is blank on the street and you can just have a public conversation and you're having it for a tenth of the cost, like 1/10 of the cost of if you had to do the kind of resurfacing as part of the capital project. So like the ability to fund kind of flexibly and orient programmatic kind of operations flexibly is super important, which is kind of the antithesis of the federal funding process, which in my mind, I have been, I'll say the federal part first, like I think is an argument to change the federal process as it relates to micro projects, which is, building a high quality bike network is a collection of micro projects, micro conversations. And, I think the federal funding has always been through this lens of let's build a huge transit project, let's build a freeway. Like those projects warrant the kind of protections and process kind of wrappers that they have micro projects haven't been contemplated to be deployed at scale to solve urban problems, which makes clearly the easiest answer right now is if your city has the capacity to do so. Many cities are doing large funding packages that are making the case for multimodal improvements, for bicycle improvements, for safety improvements. And when you do that with local funding, you have full control and you can kind of name the way it goes. And that is, the point of building the network case in Austin was to secure, and building a cost benefit case for it against large regional highway-like projects was to build the funding case to get the money to actually do the work. So the money is super important.
I want to agree with Nathan on a whole lot of that. The flexibility part is extremely important. And so the program I work off of directly is a local funding pot of about $1.5 million a year that we use to primarily retrofit existing streets to include bike facilities. But we also tap the federal programs where we can. So our trail program is almost 100% federal funding. And because of the nature of trail construction, since it's a lot more like the big projects and sort of like cutting a new road or building a new bridge, it matches the federal programmatic things and some of the reporting requirements a little bit more easily. But just having the flexibility from a local source we've found to be very important. But we still have a lot of, I'll say, red tape, since actually that term was coined at DC, but the things like the environmental reporting, the environmental reporting in theory is so that, you understand the environmental impact of giant mega projects and don't, wreck something that's of public interest in the process. And yet we have to follow it for these bike projects, which, and often in the examples that FHW provides, they use bike projects, like even ones that are, it'd be like in a riparian zone, a new bike path, as the thing that gets the exception to the rule. It doesn't have to go through these, but we still end up having to go through some fairly deep dives on historic and environmental, just to get all the check marks done for some of these projects. So those are the kind of strings that come with the federal funding that I think a revision in sort of the approach could improve a great deal. But yeah, that flexibility and being able to do things like go through an alley or go through parkland, or some of the ways that bike infrastructure and planning works, it's just unlike anything else, and you need this absolute flexibility to change the type of road you're on and to go through areas that almost no other infrastructure aside from a sidewalk might be able to do, and you still have almost no impact on it, right? So it's just very different, and I think that the federal more congressional approach to structuring such programs should be rejiggered to think about it in those ways.
I think since this is a Dutch-inspired webinar, maybe Chris could shed a little insight on the kind of federal, Netherlands federalism approach in the Netherlands transport policy and funding even.
I mean, I wish I could say the national government provides all kind of funding and leadership, but cycling remains, even to this day, a municipal responsibility, and local governments are often left scrambling to find money and funding sources for projects, especially if they're stretched between municipalities or more rural projects. They have to find other municipalities and sign agreements and collaborations with. But there are all kinds of unique places they go looking for money. I mean, if it's a bike parking facility at a train station, then they're often partnering with the public transport agencies to help fund that. If it's an improvement to a crossing at a motorway, then they will make the case to the road building association that removing bikes from the traffic light signals by elevating or tunneling the cycling infrastructure above or below the intersection will result in all these time savings for the drivers, and therefore can scrape together some money from the road builders. But there really is no kind of model that perhaps could be copied or emulated elsewhere. It's still very much a work in progress here, and it still pales in comparison to the money that gets spent on car infrastructure, unfortunately.
I missed a quote yesterday in my presentation. It was on the deck, but one of my favorite ones from the Think Bike was get used to spending more money on bikes, which is just this constant refrain. And Austin is fortunate to have more money now, and I still have to discipline myself to like build higher quality, build to the ultimate vision. Start getting the stuff on the ground in the way that you would actually want it to be, and without compromise. And I think this is like a mind frame adjustment. We drop this kind of money all the time on other types of transport infrastructure, and to see those, like the short trip capture curves that we saw of like catching 30% of trips that are 2 miles, only comes when you spend significant levels of funding and bring those systems into the safety profile that we expect for other modes.
Well, thanks. I want to thank everybody for those responses and responses to all of these questions. We're gonna wrap up our discussion period right now. And I hope this has been useful for everyone to get a little more time with our panelists and hear their thoughts on some of these lingering issues, and to know that you're not the only ones struggling with these. I think it's commonplace for any city, even the ones that are really moving forward to experience some of these challenges and really work through them. So a lot of inspiration remains from this session and from your examples that you're sharing here today. So I want to thank you all again for rejoining us for this session, and we'll get this up online, and I hope everyone will be able to follow up with our panelists separately if they have any remaining questions. Thanks very much, everybody.